You've seen it happen. Maybe it happened to you. Someone brilliant, someone who reads people for a living, someone who would never fall for an obvious scam, ends up tangled in a relationship or a deal or a friendship that, from the outside, looks so clearly manipulative that everyone around them is quietly asking the same question. How did they not see it? And the uncomfortable answer, the one most people don't want to hear, is that intelligence was never the thing protecting anyone from manipulation in the first place. It was never designed to. Think about a woman we'll call Elena. Elena ran a small marketing firm. She negotiated contracts for a living, read people across a boardroom table every single day, and prided herself, reasonably, on being hard to fool. Then she met a man at a conference who complimented her work in a way that felt specific rather than generic, who remembered small details from their first conversation the next time they spoke, who seemed, in every observable way, to simply understand her better than anyone had in years. 6 months later, she had loaned him money she never saw again, restructured her business around his advice, and lost 2 close friendships because she defended him every time someone raised a concern. The people around Elena kept saying the same thing to each other, quietly, when she wasn't in the room. She's so smart. How is she not seeing this? But that question assumes manipulation is a puzzle you solve with intelligence, the way you'd solve a difficult problem at work. It isn't. Manipulation doesn't target your reasoning. It targets the parts of you that operate before reasoning ever gets involved, the parts responsible for trust, for belonging, for the deep and mostly unconscious calculation your nervous system runs constantly about who is safe and who isn't. Intelligence sits downstream of that calculation. By the time your conscious mind is evaluating whether this person's story adds up, your body has often already decided they're safe, and everything your intelligence does from that point forward gets quietly bent toward confirming a conclusion you reached before you were aware you were reaching it. This is why the smartest people in a room are sometimes the easiest to manipulate, not despite their intelligence, but partly because of it. A highly intelligent person is extremely good at building a coherent, well-reasoned story. Give them a few true details and a plausible frame, and they will construct the rest of the narrative themselves, filling in gaps with logic so convincing that even they can't tell the difference between what the manipulator actually said and what they themselves inferred to make the whole thing make sense. Manipulators, whether or not they'd ever describe what they're doing in these terms, learn to exploit exactly this. They don't need to lie elaborately. They need only imply, suggest, drop a fragment, and let a smart target's own mind do the finishing work, because a story you built yourself is far harder to doubt than a story someone told you. Elena's manipulator never claimed to be wealthier than he was. He simply mentioned, in passing, a business trip to a city associated with money, wore a watch that implied more than it stated, let a comment about his schedule sit unexplained just long enough for Elena to fill in an assumption about his success. None of it was technically false. All of it was engineered to be misread in a specific direction by a mind sharp enough to do the misreading convincingly on its own. There's a second reason intelligence doesn't protect against manipulation, and it has to do with what psychologists sometimes call the illusion of invulnerability. People who think of themselves as hard to fool are, paradoxically, often easier to fool, because the belief that you can't be manipulated removes the one defense that actually works, which is ongoing suspicion. If you believe manipulation is something that happens to other people, gullible people, less careful people, you stop checking for it in your own relationships, because checking would require admitting the possibility applies to you. A person who knows they're capable of being fooled stays alert in a way a person who's certain of their own immunity never does. Confidence, in this specific context, functions less like armor and more like a blindfold you put on yourself. Elena would have told you, before any of this happened, that she was good at reading people, and she was, in most contexts. But that self-assessment became part of the mechanism that trapped her, because every time a friend raised a concern, her first internal response wasn't to examine the concern. It was to defend her own judgment. Admitting her friends might be seeing something she'd missed wasn't just admitting a mistake about one relationship. It was threatening the identity she'd built around being someone who doesn't get fooled. And people, generally, will protect an identity long after the evidence has stopped supporting it. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains a pattern that looks strange from the outside, but makes complete sense from the inside. When someone's friends express concern about a manipulative relationship, the manipulated person very often doesn't get defensive on behalf of the manipulator alone. They get defensive on behalf of themselves, their own competence, their own judgment. The manipulator, whether consciously or not, has usually already anticipated this and reinforced it directly, telling the target something like, "You're the only one who really understands me. Everyone else just doesn't get what we have." That line does two things at once. It flatters the target's sense of unique insight, the exact insight their intelligence prides itself on, and it preloads every future objection from outsiders as evidence of the outsider's failure to understand rather than evidence of a problem. Manipulators also, almost universally, exploit something researchers call intermittent reinforcement. This is the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive, the same one that makes certain relationships feel more compelling than stable, predictable ones. If a person is warm and rewarding every single time you interact with them, you form a calm, secure expectation of that warmth, and the relationship, while pleasant, doesn't generate much urgency. But if warmth arrives unpredictably, mixed unevenly with withdrawal, criticism, or distance, something different happens in the brain. You start working harder for the reward, not less, because uncertainty is itself a kind of hook. You find yourself replaying the good moments, searching for what you did right, trying to earn back a version of the person who was warm to you 3 days ago. And this searching, this working for approval, is exactly the dynamic that keeps people locked into relationships that outside observers can see clearly are unhealthy. Elena's manipulator was, by her account, extraordinary in their best moments, attentive, funny, generous with praise, and unpredictably distant in between, vague about plans, slow to respond, occasionally sharply critical about something small. Elena spent enormous energy trying to understand what she'd done to cause the distance, energy that, if you asked her before any of this happened, she would have said she'd never waste on a person who wasn't worth it. But by the time the pattern was fully in motion, the question of whether he was worth it had stopped being something her conscious mind was actively evaluating. She was simply reacting, the way anyone reacts to an intermittent reward, chasing the next good moment rather than assessing the pattern as a whole. None of this means intelligence is useless against manipulation. It means intelligence has to be pointed at the right target. The mistake is using intelligence to evaluate the manipulator's story, because a sophisticated mind can always construct a story sophisticated enough to survive scrutiny, especially when it's partly building that story itself. The more useful move is turning that same intelligence toward the pattern instead of the story. Not, does what they're telling me make sense, but does the way I feel around this person keep shifting in a way that has nothing to do with anything I did? Not, can I explain away this specific inconsistency, but how many inconsistencies have I already explained away this month, and does that number feel normal? There's a specific, concrete signal worth naming here, because it shows up across nearly every account of manipulation regardless of the details. It's the sensation of feeling slightly off balance around someone in a way you can't quite articulate, paired with an immediate internal instinct to explain that feeling away rather than sit with it. That instinct to explain it away is worth noticing precisely because it's so automatic. Healthy relationships rarely require constant internal justification. If you find yourself frequently generating explanations for why someone's behavior isn't actually as concerning as it felt in the moment, that frequency itself is data, regardless of how convincing any individual explanation is. Elena eventually did see it, not because she got smarter, but because the pattern accumulated past a threshold where even her own considerable skill at rationalizing couldn't keep up with it. A friend, the same one she'd argued with months earlier, sat her down and instead of describing what the manipulator was doing, simply asked her to write down every time in the last year she'd changed a plan, apologized for something unclear, or felt confused about where she stood with him. Seeing the list, in her own handwriting, did something that no argument had been able to do. It removed the story. It just left the pattern, undressed, without the narrative Elena's own intelligence had been quietly building around it for months. That's ultimately the lesson worth taking from this, and it applies far beyond any one relationship. Manipulation rarely announces itself as manipulation. It arrives as a story that makes sense, told to a mind fully capable of making it make sense. And the way out isn't to outthink the story. It's to stop evaluating the story at all and start counting the pattern instead. Write it down if you have to. Numbers and dates don't get talked out of themselves the way feelings do. And if the pattern, stripped of every reasonable explanation you've generated for it, still looks like something you wouldn't accept from anyone else in your life, it probably is.